Let's bring in Michael Kimmage. He's a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the U.S., and he's worked on the Russia-Ukraine policy planning portfolio at the U.S. State Department under the Obama administration. Mr. Kimmage, thank you for being with us on the day. Now, Russia has repeatedly said it does not target civilians. All the videos and images we've been seeing throughout this war, and especially in recent days, show that is simply not true.
Yes, it's very difficult to understand how this could be a part of the Russian military strategy, but I think we have to look at it in that light. These are soldiers who have no accountability. They seem to have been fed enormous amounts of prejudice vis-a-vis the Ukrainian population, and it seems that one of the military ideas is to instill fear and horror in the Ukrainian population, and so the result is not one isolated set of atrocities, but a pattern of atrocities across the occupied territories of Ukraine.
Let's talk about NATO for a little bit. The alliance has been very careful in walking the fine balance between member states providing support, but not putting the alliance into the conflict. Let's have a quick listen to a little bit of what Jens Stoltenberg had to say recently.
Ukraine is fighting in the defensive war. So this distinction between offensive and defensive weapons doesn't actually have any real meaning in a defensive war as Ukraine is fighting.
NATO won't be very specific about the type of weapons that member countries provide to Ukraine, Mr. Kimmage, but is that statement an indicator of how much more the alliance is potentially willing to do?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you've seen the trajectory in the last couple of weeks, really, toward more and more significant weapons being provided by NATO member states, and I think the events in Bucha and Kramatorsk more recently will only increase the speed of that provision of weapons.
Talk to us about the state of this war for Russia in this moment. We're entering the seventh week. We're in the seventh week. The Kremlin says they'll focus now on other parts of the country, but does that actually mean Putin is dropping his goal of taking the capital?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think he could be regrouping. My sense is that Putin is preparing for a very long war, a war of attrition. The active fighting is going to be more to the south and to the east in the short to medium term. But I think that the ambition to take Kiev remains. It may be beyond Russia's reach, but I don't think they've given up on that grisly goal.
What have been the difficulties for the Russian army in taking the capital? They had hoped to do that within 3 days of the war.
Well, their difficulties stem from an absurd concept of operation that the Ukrainian government would have fallen within days and just fallen apart somehow, and Zelensky would have fled. None of that turned out to be true. Then they were faced with a city that has 3 million in population and is an area roughly the size of New York City, and that would take an absolutely massive army to occupy and to conquer. And they had nowhere near the troops or the equipment to do that.
We know that the port city of Mariupol has faced relentless shelling for weeks. How crucial is this port city for the Kremlin? Why is it significant for them?
Well, two reasons, really. I think one is that if they would be able to take it, then they would direct their army more to the north in an attempted encirclement of the Ukrainian army on the eastern territories of Ukraine. And then secondly, and this is only speculation, Mariupol may be a city that Russia wishes to take permanently, as in their eyes they have taken Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine or the Donbas. And so it's potentially part of the political settlement that they may be aiming for in Ukraine.
Vladimir Putin, he's been in power for over 20 years. He's about to turn 70. What is his willingness to negotiate at this juncture of the war, at this juncture in his life?
I think very, very small at this particular moment. The war has not gone well for Russia. That's absolutely clear. A lot of their political goals, I think, are going to be very hard for them to reach if they ever do. But the idea that Putin would give up is hard to believe. And I think the Ukrainians are going to have a hard time, for all of the reasons your program this evening indicates, making compromises with Russia. So unless Putin gets a lot in return, he's not going to stop. But I think he's really not on the verge of getting much from Ukraine, so likely a long conflict is just beginning.
Can you talk to us a little bit about diplomacy? Analyst after analyst says this is the only way out of this war. This war will not be won on the battlefield, but diplomacy, as we know, requires time that civilians under attack in Ukraine do not have.
No, that's correct. I mean, the humanitarian side of the equation for President Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine is very punishing. Each day is a day that the Ukrainians pay for in blood. So I know, wants to wrap up the conflict as quickly as he possibly can. But he doesn't want to do so on Russian terms. And until the Russians have really exhausted themselves, and I think they're not close to doing that, there just isn't that middle ground. So the point of exhaustion will be reached at some point, but it could be months or even years from today's date.
We can't talk about this war without talking about the Ukrainian resistance. How different is this military than the one that Russia faced when it invaded the first time in 2014?
Oh, it's profoundly different, and it's different in terms of unity. It's different in terms of leadership. I think the political leadership is much more powerful than it was in 2014, but it's also been expertly trained by NATO member states, including the United States, and that's really shown a great difference, not to mention the rapid provision of military aid in the last couple of weeks. So it's a new army, and it's certainly one that Russia was not prepared to fight and is struggling to fight effectively.
Michael Kimmage, a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Thank you very much for your time and your insights, Mr. Kimmage.
Thank you for having me.